We'll take a suite. You're paying, right? Mrs. Ines Rossetti said in a cold and at the same time defiantly confident tone, barely crossing the threshold of the hotel lobby, decorated with marble columns and abstract compositions of fresh flowers, which seemed to have been placed here specifically to shade her arrogance. My mother-in-law said that my parents and I checked into the hotel, as if wanting to emphasize that this was not our own choice, but rather a short-sighted decision dictated by the limitations of our funds and the lack of an elementary sense of tact. Mom is right, David unexpectedly agreed, without taking his eyes off the phone screen, as if thereby trying to avoid the need to maintain a conversation that was beginning to take the form of not a discussion, but an interrogation. They should be comfortable, he added, nodding towards the porter, as if hinting that guests, no matter how you look at it, should feel as if they are not asking for favors, but doing a favor with their presence. A few minutes later, my relatives, having barely crossed the threshold of the hall, froze, hearing how my father, taking a pause between words, slowly and restrainedly said, "Just so you know, that day is still vivid in my memory." A bright, cloudless Tuesday when I was supposed to meet David's parents for the first time. My father's words sounded unexpectedly loud in the space filled with the soft hum of voices and the rustle of pages being turned at the reception desk. I remember how I had butterflies in my stomach then, but I was looking forward to this moment, believing that everything would go smoothly, that worries would dissolve in friendly smiles and toasts to the future. David and I had already been together for 2 years, and he had just proposed to me, so exciting and wonderful that I, without a second's hesitation, said yes, not even having time to properly realize how many unspoken expectations and difficulties were hidden behind that yes. Although I had heard a lot about his family, I had not yet met them in person. He always said that they were rather old-fashioned, but I did not fully understand what that meant until I came face to face with them, and only then did I feel the full weight of that word, old-fashioned, which turned into cold formality, criticism, and a lack of basic human warmth. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy. We decided to meet at a local cafe, a quiet, cozy place on the street corner that smelled of fresh pastries and ground coffee. I arrived first, wearing my favorite blue dress, which, as it seemed to me, emphasized both my modesty and my sense of style, and I sincerely hoped to make a good impression. David arrived a little later with his parents, Mrs. Ines Rossetti, a woman with thin lips drawn into a line of discontent and an expression that seemed to be forever looking for something to reproach, and Mr. Luigi Rossetti, silent, dry and cold, who seemed to be only a shadow of his wife, mechanically nodding in agreement with her every word. "Claudia, these are my parents, Luigi and Ines Rossetti," David introduced us, and there was some tension in his voice, as if he already knew how everything would go. "Nice to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Rossetti," I said with a smile, holding out my hand. "Exactly the same," Mrs. Rossetti answered, barely touching my fingers and looking me up and down with the same look with which one inspects goods before buying. "David told us that you are a lawyer. Where do you work?" she asked, as if continuing a previously prepared list of questions. I was taken aback by her directness, but managed to answer. "In the office of Johnson and Partners, in the city center." "And your salary must be good, being a lawyer and all that," Mr. Rossetti interjected in a sharp, even slightly ear-piercing tone. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "It's enough for my needs," I said, trying to keep my tone light and neutral. Mrs. Rossetti raised an eyebrow, as if she didn't like my answer. "And where do you plan to live after the wedding?" she asked, and I glanced at David, hoping that he would intervene and take over this part of the conversation, but he just shrugged. "We're still discussing it," I said, realizing that his support at this point was ephemeral. "And your parents? What do they do?" asked Mr. Rossetti, and there was neither curiosity nor friendliness in his voice, only a demanding insistence. "They're a small business," I answered, feeling the awkwardness tightening my shoulders. "A small business, huh?" snorted Mrs. Rossetti. "Let's hope they can make a worthy contribution to the wedding." I felt my stomach twist, but tried not to show my nervousness. David noticed my discomfort, but said nothing, just stared intently into his teacup. As we ordered, Mrs. Rossetti kept making comments about the prices, choosing dishes not by taste but by cost, as if to emphasize who was really calling the shots here. And Mr. Rossetti kept nodding, as if approving of her every word. The entire meeting felt more like a business deal than a family gathering, and at some point I found myself wondering, is this really what my future looks like? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the excitement of a first meeting, but deep down I knew it was a red flag I couldn't ignore. It wasn't long after that first meeting that David's parents became a constant, unsettling presence in my life, like a shadow that couldn't be brushed away. They called at all hours, disrupting my daily routine and even my dreams, because every ring of the phone began to feel like an intrusion into my inner world. One evening, just as I was about to leave the office, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Rossetti. "Claudia, my dear, I need you to look over some legal paperwork for us." "It's just a small favor," she said, and her voice was laced not with a request but with an expectation, as if she wasn't even considering a refusal. I sighed, feeling the weight of her request, and though there was hesitation in my voice, I tried to keep my tone polite, hoping that she would understand at least a little about the boundaries. "Mrs. Rossetti, I'm actually just leaving work. Can this wait?" I asked, holding the phone between my ear and shoulder, while gathering my papers and laptop, for it was already early Friday evening and I was dreaming of nothing but silence and a glass of wine. "Oh, it's just a quick glance. You can do that, can't you?" "For the sake of the family," she pressed, and her voice once again sounded like that mixture of mock concern and categorical insistence that I was beginning to recognize by ear. I reluctantly agreed, realizing that this was becoming a habit, to give in, to say yes when I wanted to say no, and, closing my eyes, I knew this would not be the last time. The next day, just as I was beginning to enjoy my morning coffee, the phone rang, and the name Mr. Rossetti appeared on the screen again. I already knew that this was not a greeting with a good morning. "Claudia, I need help setting up the new television. David is busy. Can you pop in?" he said, not bothering to greet me, as if I had long been part of their logistical chain. Their requests became more frequent and more demanding, as if I were not a future daughter-in-law but a convenient free service, ready to help at any time of the day or night, without compensation, without gratitude, simply because that's the way it's done. I tried to talk to David about it, clenching my palms and trying to contain my irritation. "David, your parents are constantly calling me for legal advice, for technical support, for everything," I said, hoping that he would understand how much his parents' intrusion had become a daily stress for me. "They're just being friendly, Claudia." "They're like that with everyone," he replied casually, waving away my concerns with that indifference that hurts more than rudeness. "But this is too much. They're calling me at work at odd hours." "I feel depressed," I insisted, wanting to get through to him. "Come on, Claudia. They're harmless, they're just trying to connect with you," he said, not looking me in the eye, and I felt that familiar wave of frustration and helplessness, because it seemed as if David was completely blind to his parents' overbearing behavior, and worse, he didn't want to see it. One evening, while we were having dinner at my house, in what I hoped would be at least a little serene, the phone rang, and to my unsurprise, I saw Mrs. Rossetti's name on the screen. "Claudia, can you come tomorrow? I need advice on redecorating the living room." "You have such good taste," she said, and there was that tone in her voice that brooked no refusal. "Mrs. Rossetti, I'm not really an interior designer." I began, trying to gently but firmly set the boundaries, but she cut me off as if I were a schoolgirl who hadn't understood a basic assignment. "But you have such a beautiful house." "I insist." "We'll have lunch," she said, and it sounded more like an order than a request. I hung up, feeling trapped, and David, after a fleeting glance at me, simply shrugged and said, "See, they really like you," as if that was enough to justify everything else. But it seemed to me that they were simply using me, as if my time, my energy, even my professional skills had become something self-evident to them. And David's indifference only made things worse, turning my inner protest into despair. I began to wonder if my future with David would be like this, constantly at his parents' beck and call, deprived of our own space, our own eye. Without any encouragement from him, David suggested that we go out for dinner with his parents on Friday night. He had chosen a posh restaurant in the city center, the kind where you think twice before looking at the prices on the menu, because even a glance is enough to make your bank account shrink in alarm. I had a feeling this would not be your usual relaxing dinner, and I was right. We arrived at the restaurant to find the Rossettis already there, studying the menu, as if they were on a serious tasting mission. Mrs. Rossetti's eyes lit up when she saw the lobster and steak options. "Claudia, you simply must try the lobster. It's divine," she exclaimed, her voice full of enthusiasm, almost theatrical, as if she wanted the whole room to hear her joy. I glanced at the menu and saw a price that was, to put it mildly, more than I wanted to spend on dinner, especially since I was tired and in no mood for a gastronomic show. But before I could respond, Mr. Rossetti intervened. "David tells us you're doing well at your firm. Surely a successful lawyer like you can afford to splurge a little now and then," he said, his tone a little too sharp, with that undercurrent of mockery that only those who don't want to hear miss. Feeling cornered, I smiled weakly and said, "Actually, I was thinking of something lighter. A salad, perhaps." Mrs. Rossetti looked at me as if I'd suggested something outrageous, almost blasphemous. "A salad? Nonsense. You're in one of the finest restaurants in town. You have to try their specialties," she insisted, and I felt uneasy, but I decided not to argue because I didn't want to make a scene in a place where the waiters spoke in hushed tones and couples sat around enjoying wine for the price of a monthly gym membership. As we ate, the conversation revolved around David and his achievements, as if I were attending a banquet in his honor, and his parents asked a few questions about my work from time to time, but didn't really listen to my answers, rather politely waiting for me to stop so they could continue their eulogy of their son. And then came the moment of truth, the bill. As if by some invisible signal that only the three of them understood, Mr. Rossetti, slowly and with a kind of theatrical thoughtfulness, patted his jacket pockets, then his trousers, assumed a bewildered expression and, as if once again confirming his talent for social manipulation, looked at his wife with mild surprise. "Oh, dear, I think I've left my purse at home," he said with such serene confidence that any outside observer might have mistaken it for innocent forgetfulness rather than a pre-staged scene, and his voice sounded far too calm for a man who had just dined lavishly at someone else's expense. Mrs. Rossetti joined in the farce, instantly taking up the part, as if they had actually rehearsed it beforehand. "Luigi, how could you be so forgetful?" "I don't have one either," she replied with a feigned surprise that only someone who wasn't used to playing along could have disputed. I looked at David, expecting him, as a grown man and, after all, my fiancé, to intervene and at least offer to pay for the dinner, but he just shrugged, staring at his phone, and muttered something like, "I guess I forgot my card, too." I couldn't believe it, couldn't even imagine that such a situation was possible, and, what's even more offensive, that its participants didn't even try to hide their frivolity. It was clear that this was not just forgetfulness, not an absurd accident, but something more. It looked more like a setup, a carefully planned humiliation, in which I was assigned the role of a payment instrument, proceeds, a guarantor that the family evening would end on a full stomach. Feeling hurt and humiliated, I pulled out my bank card and handed it to the waiter, trying not to meet anyone's eyes at the table. Mrs. Rossetti smiled sweetly at me, her gaze full of that false gratitude that seems more humiliating than a direct demand. "Thank you, dear. You are a savior," she said, and her words, like a woven wreath of artificial flowers, were beautiful to look at but completely lifeless. As we left the restaurant, I felt a mixture of anger and distrust, a fierce resistance inside that fought with an even more painful feeling of disappointment. Was I just a walking wallet to them? And why didn't David say anything? Why did he choose to retreat again when I needed at least a shadow of his support? As the wedding approached, it became increasingly clear that our parents needed to meet, and given my experience with David's parents, I prepared for this meeting with the utmost care, as if it were an operation where the slightest mistake could lead to disaster. I remember pacing the living room with the phone in my hand, rehearsing how I would break the news to my parents, trying to find a tone that would not sound alarming but respectful, trying to choose words that would convey the importance of the moment without making them suspect how nervous I was. Finally, I plucked up the courage to call them. "Hi, Mom. Dad, I think you should meet David's parents," I said, trying to sound even, calm, almost casual, as if this were an ordinary family event and not a meeting on which I felt the future of my marriage depended. "Oh, Claudia, we're so excited. When can we meet them?" There was a mixture of enthusiasm and lively curiosity in my mother's voice, as if they had been waiting for this moment to better understand my chosen one and his roots. I took a deep breath before adding a cautious note, I want to warn you, they are a little intense." A light chuckle immediately followed in my father's voice, so familiar and warm. "Claudia, we've seen a lot in our time. Don't worry, we'll get through this." His confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't shake off my fears, because I knew that seeing is not only hearing, but also feeling, and feeling the pressure of Ines Rossetti and the condescending silence of Luigi is not the same as hearing about them over the phone. We chose the Grandview Hotel, known for its pleasant atmosphere and beautiful surroundings, hoping that the neutral space, light table settings and soft music would help smooth out the edges and allow the conversation to flow like a calm river. It was a familiar place, and I hoped that its warm interior and friendly staff would distract me if the situation became too tense. The next day, over breakfast, I told David about this plan. "So, we're meeting at the Grandview Hotel this Saturday." "I thought our parents would enjoy meeting in a neutral, relaxed setting," I said, pouring myself some coffee and trying not to show how much this all worried me. David nodded, still staring at his phone. "Sure, that sounds good. I'll let my people know." His calm was almost insulting, as if none of this directly affected him. I spent the next few days in a rush to prepare, trying to plan every detail, from the reservations to the seating arrangements, from the menu to the topic of conversation, hoping that it would help keep the peace and prevent the bomb that I felt was ticking away. As the day approached, my nerves began to fray, and I found myself obsessing over every little detail, from what I would wear to how I would smoothly steer the conversation away from potentially sensitive topics, trying to anticipate even intonations and facial expressions. The night before the meeting, I lay awake, running through various scenarios in my head, modeling dialogues, anticipating pauses in which something awkward would hang. What if David's parents said something offensive? What if my parents didn't like them? What if the whole lunch turned into a disaster that could not be stopped? On the morning of the meeting, I was a bundle of nerves. I chose a simple but elegant dress, hoping to find a balance between casual and formal, between confidence and modesty. David, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed by the significance of the day. "It's just lunch, Claudia. Everything will be fine," he said casually, getting dressed as if we were going for a walk rather than the first meeting of two families, intended to be the basis of our common future. His calmness did nothing to calm my anxiety. If anything, I felt even more alone in my problems, and wondered, does he really understand how his parents' behavior affects me, or does he just choose to ignore it? As we drove to the hotel, I thought about the plan: keep the conversation light, avoid controversial topics, and try to get along, because this was not just a formal meeting of two families, but a kind of endurance test, a test of how two different worlds could try to coexist, at least for one meal. Simple, right? The Grandview Hotel looked as stunning as always, its elegant facade basking in the midday sun, reflecting off the glass doors and creating an almost fairy tale-like illusion of coziness and well-being. As David and I entered the lobby, filled with the scent of sandalwood and freshly cut lilies, I immediately noticed my parents sitting in the living room by the panoramic windows. They stood up as soon as we approached, with genuine smiles on their faces, which for me were a comfort and an anchor in this ocean of uncertainty. "Claudia, darling, you look lovely," my mother said, hugging me reassuringly, her hands warm and her eyes full of support. My father patted my back firmly and reassuringly, and I felt the tension inside me thaw a little. David's parents arrived soon after, and the very atmosphere seemed to change as soon as they entered. It became cooler, as if the air conditioning had turned up the pressure, and Mrs. Rossetti's eyes instantly swept the lobby with a glance that was neither happy nor interested, but rather the appraising squint of an expert who judges by price tags and reputations. "A nice place you've chosen, Claudia," Mr. Rossetti commented dryly, shaking my parents' hands with that measured politeness that does not suggest intimacy. "We thought it would be a nice place for everyone to come together," I replied, trying to sound cheerful, as if I didn't notice, as if everything was going just as it should. We moved into the dining area, and that's when things took an unexpected turn, when a hotel employee approached us, looking apologetic and with strained politeness in his voice. "I'm so sorry, but we're a little overbooked today. We only have a few singles and 2 triples, he explained, trying not to make eye contact with anyone who, in his experience, usually reacted with irritation. "One of the triples is our best suite, with all the amenities. The other option is more basic and is close to the road, so it can be a little noisy, he added, pausing briefly. Before I could say anything, Mrs. Rossetti, promptly and uninvited as always, intervened in the conversation. Well, obviously, Luigi, David and I will have a suite. Claudia, you can cover the expenses, right? After all, you arranged this meeting, she said with the same mixture of force and self-satisfaction that I was beginning to perceive as her calling card. I was stunned by her audacity, paused for a second, searching my mind for some kind of wording to express my disagreement, but all I could manage was, well, I thought my parents and I could have a suite, and before I could even finish my sentence, Mrs. Rossetti interrupted, nonsense. We are guests, and besides, you have a big salary as a lawyer. There was no irony in her voice, only a conviction that the world should adjust to her standards. My father, trying to diffuse the situation, suggested, why don't we discuss this over dinner and then decide, and I silently thanked him for this step back from the abyss. The dinner passed in a tense atmosphere, the same invisible tension that is felt in every movement, in every look, hung around the table, and although the conversation was going on, it was taut, like a string that can be broken by one awkward word. I noticed how David's parents assessed my ancestors. Their comments were emphatically neutral, but they contained subtle barbs about the simplicity of dishes, homely manner of speech, unpretentious taste in clothes. My parents, to their credit, kept their cool and responded with grace and humor, skillfully avoiding provocations, not allowing themselves to be drawn into a war for dignity that they did not start. As dinner was drawing to a close and the waiter was clearing away the empty plates, the topic of the room resurfaced, as if it had been held underwater and was now being released. Mrs. Rossetti was adamant, we should get a suite. It's right. Claudia can afford it, she said, as if this were a question of budget allocation in a large corporation rather than a family compromise. David, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up, Mother is right. It's important that they are comfortable. I couldn't believe my ears. Was he really on their side in this matter? Did my opinion not matter to him? My mother, ever the peacemaker, suggested, why don't we let the hotel decide? They can assign rooms based on availability, but Mrs. Rossetti wouldn't allow even that neutral option. Claudia, she said, addressing me with the same cool politeness, your family runs a small business. I imagine you're not used to luxury. The simplest room will do for you. It's just designed for people with a small income. The tension was palpable, as if the air in the lobby had grown thicker, harder to breathe. I felt a mixture of anger and distrust, because this wasn't just a question of rooms. It was a question of respect, which David's parents didn't seem to have, especially for me and my family, whom they hadn't even bothered to get to know. As the tension in the hotel lobby grew, my father, Bruno Sorrentino, cleared his throat and stepped forward, attracting everyone's attention. There's something you should all know, he said, his voice calm and confident, and at that moment all eyes, David's, his parents, and mine, turned to him with curiosity and a little confusion. This hotel, Dad continued, speaking with the calm confidence that comes only from years of patient work and restrained pride, like several others around the country, is owned by our family business. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Rossetti's jaw dropped, her lips parted as if she couldn't believe she had heard correctly, and Mr. Rossetti's eyes, usually hidden behind indifference, suddenly widened with the surprise of a man who suddenly learned that his interlocutor was not just a shadowy figure, but a man of influence and power. David turned to me, his expression a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and something else, perhaps embarrassment, or regret, or perhaps the same confusion one feels when suddenly realizing that there has been someone next to one all this time whom one has never really gotten to know. Are you the owner of this hotel? Mrs. Rossetti finally managed to say, and her voice no longer sounded haughty as before, but tensely polite, almost respectful. Yes, and a few more, Dad replied casually, as if this were no more than a routine matter. We have always preferred to remain in the shadows. At this point, the hotel employee, who had been acting reserved until then, suddenly became very confused. His face turned pale, he straightened up and almost bowed. Mr. Sorrentino, I apologize for the inconvenience. I had no idea, Dad waved his concern away. It's all right, but we'll have the suite and David's family can stay in the other room. And please, Claudia shouldn't have to pay. Suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch, Mrs. Rossetti's demeanor changed dramatically. She became overly fawning, her tone dripping with newfound affection, each word flowing like sweet syrup. Bruno, Claudia, what a wonderful surprise. We had no idea. You must be very proud of your achievements. David, who had remained silent until now turned to me, his eyes eager, almost excited. Claudia, this is incredible. Should we bring the wedding date forward, don't you think? I looked around and saw their changed faces, the forced smiles, the obsequious attitudes, the quick glances full of expectation and insincerity. It was all too much. Too false, too late to make any difference. I took a deep breath, and inside me, like a clear and resonant bell, a decision rang out. In fact, David, there will be no wedding. I am calling off the engagement. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, cutting through the silence like a blade, making everyone freeze. Mrs. Rossetti's smile faded instantly, turning into a strained grimace. Mr. Rossetti looked stunned, his lips twitching but making no sound, and David, as if deprived of support, was speechless, his eyes darting between me, my father, and his parents. I cannot be part of a family that values people only by their wealth and status, I said, and my voice was even, clear, almost emotionless, although everything inside was seething with tension. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving behind pretense, expectations, and a future that no longer felt right. As I left the hotel, my heart pounding and my mind racing, not yet sure what would happen next but knowing for sure that I no longer wanted it, I heard David's footsteps hurrying after me. Claudia, wait. Please, let's talk about this, he begged, his voice full of desperation, as if he had only just realized how far things had gone. I stopped and turned to face him, feeling a surge of determination that could no longer be suppressed. What is there to talk about, David? About your parents' behavior? About your indifference? My words sounded harsh, but I knew they were true. Before David could respond, Mrs. Rossetti came running up to us, her face red with anger, her eyes blazing. Ungrateful girl. After all we've done for you, she spat, her words full of venom, as if she no longer felt the need to maintain a veneer of politeness. I stared at her incredulously, amazed at how quickly a person could drop the mask. What have you done for me? You've only disrespected me and my family, I replied, my voice low, but every word coldly clear. Mrs. Rossetti's tirade continued, her words growing more and more offensive. Silly girl, you and your parents think you're better than us, don't you? David seemed torn between us, his mouth opening and closing, but unable to speak. Then my father, Bruno, intervened. His voice was calm, but there was an authority in it that immediately stopped Mrs. Rossetti in her tracks. I think it's time for you to leave our hotel, he said firmly. Mrs. Rossetti chuckled. We're not going anywhere. You can't make us. Dad turned to the hotel staff, still standing nearby, unsure what to do. Please see Mr. and Mrs. Rossetti out. They are no longer welcome here. The staff politely but firmly told David's parents to leave. Mrs. Rossetti was still hurling insults at them as they left the hotel, her voice growing shrill and pathetic. David looked at me, his eyes a mixture of confusion and regret. Claudia, I'm sorry. I didn't expect, he began, but I cut him off. It's too late for apologies, David. Your silence told me all I needed to know. With these last words, I walked away from him without turning around. The sound of his mother's angry voice faded away somewhere in the background, like the echo of a passing storm, leaving behind only silence and a clear sky. I felt a strange, dual mixture of sadness and relief wash over me, as if two opposing streams of feelings merged into one turbulent current that swept through me and left behind a clear understanding. Yes, it was painful to end the relationship with David, because no matter how many warning signs there were, affection does not disappear instantly, and the heart clings to illusions. But I knew that this was the right decision, firm, reasonable and, perhaps, the only possible one. As I drove home, looking out the car window at the scenery rushing past, the weight of the day's events began to sink in, not with a bang but in gentle waves, each bringing with it the realization that this was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, a new, honest one. in which I had stood up for myself and refused to settle for anything less than what I truly deserved. The days following the breakup were a whirlwind of emotions, and though I tried to remain calm, my insides swung between bitterness, sudden flashes of relief, and a newfound sense of freedom that was at first terrifying but then became increasingly inspiring. The decision to end my engagement to David, as painful as it had been, felt like the first step toward a future in which I would once again respect my own worth, not because someone approved of me, but because I would no longer allow myself to be devalued. One evening, as I sat on the porch, covered with a blanket and listening to the trees whisper softly in the wind, my mother called from inside, "Claudia, how are you holding up, honey?" Her voice was full of concern and at the same time that motherly confidence that always sounded like a calming incantation. I took a deep breath, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, and without taking my eyes off the evening miracle, I answered, "I'm fine, Mom." It was hard, but I feel like it was the right decision. "You're stronger than you think, Claudia, and we're so proud of you," she said warmly, coming out to me with a mug of tea in her hands. I smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for my supportive family, for their quiet strength that was my rock when the rest of the world was reeling. "Thank you, Mom. I don't know what I would do without you and Dad." There was a brief pause, filled with the quiet of the evening, before she spoke again. "You know, sometimes the end of one thing is just the beginning of something new, something better." Her words struck a chord within me, making my heart skip a beat, not from pain, but from the realization of how much truth there was in those simple words. "You're right, Mom. This is a chance for a new beginning." On those days when fear and doubt hung like storm clouds, I threw myself into work, into tasks, into challenges that gave my day structure and kept my mind off the old ways. I spent time with friends who were my rock, and their support became a constant reminder that I was not alone, that there were people out there who saw my value and accepted me unconditionally. One weekend, as my best friend Jenna and I were sitting at our favorite coffee shop, having lunch and chatting about nothing and everything, she suddenly said, "You know, Claudia, I think you did something that most people wouldn't dare do. You stood up for yourself." I nodded, stirring my coffee with a spoon, and my voice carried the strength I had recently acquired. It was hard, but I realized that I have to be true to myself. I can't be in a relationship where I'm not valued. Jenna smiled, raising her glass of white wine. "To new beginnings and self-respect. Let this be the beginning of something beautiful for you." I clinked glasses with hers, and in that moment, as the clinking of the glass mingled with the light laughter at the next table, I actually felt optimistic about the future, for the first time, not as a forced consolation, but as a genuine feeling within myself. In the weeks that followed, I found a new sense of independence, a sense of self that had long been dulled by compromise. I explored hobbies I had put on the back burner, returned to painting, to long evening walks alone, and even began planning a solo trip, the kind I'd always dreamed of but never had the courage to do. Life after David was different, sometimes lonely, sometimes strange, but there was strength in that. I realized that being alone was nothing to be afraid of, because it wasn't isolating, but an opportunity to rediscover myself and figure out what I really wanted in life. As I packed my suitcases for my upcoming trip, carefully packing not only my things but also my dreams, I felt an excitement that filled me with energy. This was my journey, my path to discovering who I was beyond relationships, beyond the expectations of others. I moved forward, not with bitterness, but with hope and an open heart, ready to accept everything that lay ahead, and with each step I realized more and more clearly, I was not just taking back my freedom, I was taking back myself. Leave a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like. See you soon.